Hey everybody, let's discuss some essential profile considerations you're going to want to be aware of when you're using a service provider. Service providers and participants need some coordination. Service providers and participants need to coordinate who is responsible for managing profiles and connections. And depending on the relationship, it may be one or the other. You see, the service provider can either handle all profile management or they can have a more limited role. As the participant, you get to determine that. Let's consider the FedNow interface permissions. Participants and service providers must decide how their permissions and responsibilities are divided up, especially if there are multiple service providers that are going to be involved. This includes deciding, first of all, who can actually edit participant profiles. Do you want to keep it to where only the participant does, or do you allow a service provider to do that? Number two, who can send and receive messages? Number three, who can request and receive reports? You see, if a service provider can edit a participant profile in the FedNow interface, they must inform the participant about any changes they make. That's important. Multiple service providers may have the ability to edit a participant's profile. So in this case, communication becomes extremely crucial because making changes could affect one or the other, right? Now, if multiple service providers have access to a participant's profile, they can view each other's connection party names and IDs and permissions that are associated with those parties. Now, another consideration has to deal with our broadcast messages. See, the FedNow Service broadcasts messages to the connection party or the service provider. That's a message telling you, hey, what's going on with the system and where it's at and how it's working type deal. The service provider is then responsible for forwarding any relevant messages and information to the participants. And as a participant, you may or may not need to receive these messages from the service provider. You'll want to make that decision. Most likely, the service provider is handling everything for you. Maybe not, but most likely. And you will access what you need through the interface the service provider has in place, but you may go directly to the FedNow one. One more thing, in case of a suspension. Yeah, what happens? If a participant profile connected via a service provider's authorized connection profile is suspended, the FRB Services Support Center will inform the service provider of the suspension. So if a participant gets suspended, they're going to tell the service provider. And the service provider can also see the suspension status themselves when they're in the FedNow interface. And if the participant is a customer credit transfer and receive, or just a receive-only participant, the service provider will receive a FedNow broadcast message indicating that that participant is signed off and shouldn't be sending or receiving messages. So in essence, the service providers play a key role in helping participants to use the FedNow service. They can, if allowed, manage participant profiles, handle the permissions, and communicate important information. It's up to you to determine as a participant what you allow them to do. So it's essential for participants and service providers to communicate and to coordinate these responsibilities effectively. When you go to onboard to the FedNow service, you'll want to take all of this into consideration to determine how best to ensure your processing will work as expected. For now, the only thing I expect is to move on to a different class because this one's over. Class dismissed.